Dust Creek, Wyoming Territory, winter 1887. The wind howled through the empty station, sweeping snow across the tracks and carrying the scent of cold iron. The last train of the evening pulled away in a cloud of steam, leaving behind nothing but silence, and a single figure standing alone on the platform. A young woman, no more than 20, clutched a bundled baby tight against her chest. The coat on her back was thin, worn to threads at the sleeves, and her hands shook from more than just the cold. She stood exactly where he'd left her an hour ago, the echo of his last words still lingering in her mind. "Wait here. I'll be right back." But he hadn't come back. The station clerk stepped out from the office, rubbing his gloved hands together against the chill. "Miss," he called out, his voice rough with the wind. "Need your name for the station book." She didn't move. Snow gathered on her lashes, melting down her cheeks in thin trails that might have been tears. "My name," she repeated, the word catching like a splinter in her throat. "Yes, ma'am," the man replied, shivering. "Just for the record." She looked down at the baby in her arms, so small, so quiet, and then at her own trembling fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't have one anymore." The clerk blinked. "Ma'am?" But when he saw her hollow eyes, the cracked lips, and the bundle she held so protectively, his expression softened. He muttered something under his breath and disappeared back into his office. She sat down on the wooden bench, its surface stiff with frost. The baby whimpered, and she rocked him gently, whispering, "Hush now, sweetheart. Mama's here." But her own voice broke as she said it. Once she had a name, Evelyn Hart, daughter of Reverend Nathaniel Hart, the most respected man in her hometown. Every Sunday she sat straight in the front pew, gloved hands folded, singing hymns with a voice as soft as the spring rain. People used to nod when she passed. "That Hart girl," they'd say. "She'll make a fine preacher's wife someday." And maybe she would have until the summer he came. A man from the East, polished boots, soft hands, and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. He spoke of cities that gleamed under gaslight, of new beginnings and fortunes waiting to be made. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she was his future. By autumn, she was carrying his child. When her father found out, he gathered the congregation, Bible in hand, and thundered from the pulpit. "You have brought sin into this house," he said, eyes burning with a fury she'd never seen before. "You are no longer my daughter. You have shamed the name of Hart. Do not speak it, do not carry it, do not wear it again." Her mother stood behind him, face pale, apron clutched in her fists. Not a tear, not a word. That night, Evelyn packed what she could, a thin blanket, a few coins, the last of her hope, and walked away from the only home she had ever known. The man was waiting for her at the edge of town, all soft words and promises. "We'll go to Wyoming," he'd said. "Start over. A wedding, a new life. You'll see." But promises don't last long in the cold. Now in the white emptiness of Dust Creek, she understood what it meant to have no name. The baby stirred, tiny hands flailing against the blanket. Evelyn held him close, rocking in time with the wind. "Hush, sweetheart. Mama's here." "Mama's." Her voice cracked again, breaking under the weight of the lie. The few people passing through the station looked at her, and then away. A woman pulled her own child closer. The lantern overhead flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. She pressed her cheek to her baby's forehead, whispering prayers she no longer believed in. Then, a shadow fell across her. She looked up. A man stood in front of her, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat dark with snow. His hat brim was low, hiding most of his face, but she could see the edge of a scar along his jaw. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Without a word, he unwrapped the scarf from around his neck and laid it gently across her shoulders. The weight of it startled her, the warmth even more so. I have no name," she whispered. "He left us." The man's gaze was steady, his eyes gray as the storm behind him. When he spoke, his voice was rough but quiet, like gravel smoothed by time. "You do now." For a moment she just stared, words lost somewhere in the cold. Then he extended a gloved hand. Hesitant, she reached out, and when her fingers met his, the chill in her bones began to fade. Together, they stepped off the platform and into the snow. The road was empty, the storm thick as fog. The man, Richard Avery, though she didn't know it yet, led her down a narrow path toward a faint light in the distance. His boots crunched against the frozen earth. Hers stumbled behind, her arms still tight around the baby. They reached a low wooden structure, half stable, half station, with a single lantern burning by the door. Richard opened it, holding it wide. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before stepping inside. Warmth. Hay. Fire. The smell of horses and smoke. The stableman behind the counter looked up, pipe hanging from his mouth. "Evenin', Richard." "Who's the girl?" "She's with me," Richard said simply. That was all. He crossed the room, tossed another log on the fire, and the baby stirred in the heat. The girl, Evelyn though the name felt far away, found a seat near the hearth and loosened her hold just enough for the child to breathe. Richard stood near the door, coat dripping, silent as stone. Some men filled the air with noise. Richard Avery filled it with presence. The stableman smirked. "Never thought I'd see you bring someone in, Avery. Guess even ghosts need firelight sometimes." Richard didn't answer. He never did, and for the first time in months, Evelyn, no, Jane, she decided, felt the fear inside her begin to thaw. Jane woke to the soft crackle of firewood and the faint scent of coffee. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the stable wall, turning the air gold. The baby slept soundly against her chest, warm and safe for the first time in weeks. Across the room, Richard Avery stood by the stove, adjusting the flame. His movements were quiet, efficient, the kind of silence that came not from awkwardness, but from a man who'd long since learned that most things didn't need words. Jane shifted on the bench, pulling his scarf closer around her shoulders. The fabric still smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She hadn't realized until that moment how deeply she'd forgotten what safety felt like. When Richard noticed she was awake, he only gave a small nod toward the tin cup on the table beside her. Steam curled from it. "Drink," he said simply. His voice wasn't unkind, just steady, low and unbothered. She nodded, whispering, "Thank you." He said nothing more, just turned back to the fire. It took a few hours before she dared to ask his name. He was repairing a bridle near the door, fingers working leather with practiced ease. She hesitated, then spoke softly. You never told me your name." He looked up, the faintest flicker of surprise in his gray eyes. Then, just as quietly, he answered, "Avery, Richard Avery." The name fit him, solid, unpolished, dependable. She hesitated, eyes dropping to the floorboards. "Thank you, Mr. Avery, for the scarf." "For not asking. Didn't need to," he said. Something in his tone made her look up. Not curiosity, not pity, just quiet respect, the kind she hadn't known existed anymore. She found her courage somewhere small and trembling inside her chest. "I used to be Evelyn Hart," her voice caught, "but I'm not allowed to use that name anymore." He didn't react, didn't press. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small torn scrap of paper, a page from an old Bible, creased and soft from touch. "This was wrapped in the blanket," she explained. "It's from the book of Job. There's a name written at the top corner. Jane," her lips quivered. "It's not much, but I think I'll go by that now." Richard's gaze lingered on her for a long, quiet moment before he gave a single nod. "Jane it is." And just like that, the name didn't feel borrowed anymore. As the day stretched on, she began to notice the world around him, the way his every action was precise but never rushed. When he stoked the fire, it was with care. When he adjusted the saddle straps, he checked each buckle twice. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. The stableman, still behind the counter, muttered something under his breath. "Never thought I'd see the day Richard Avery brought someone in. Guess even ghosts need firelight sometimes." Richard ignored him, gaze fixed on the snow outside. His profile in the lantern light was sharp, a man carved by loss, his silence heavy but not empty. Jane could feel it too. There was pain there, buried deep but not bitterness. It made her wonder what he'd lost. That night, as the wind howled outside, Richard took one of his saddle blankets, folded it neatly, and set it by her feet. Not too close, not too far, just enough to make sure she knew she was safe. Jane blinked back tears she didn't mean to shed. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but he didn't mention it. The days that followed unfolded quietly. Each morning, she woke to the rhythm of his boots across the floorboards, the creak of the barn door, the sound of horses shifting in their stalls. He was always up before dawn, chopping wood, feeding livestock, checking the fence lines. She tried to help in small ways, fetching water, tidying the stove, washing what few dishes they had. Her hands were clumsy at first. She burned the beans, overboiled the tea, and her first attempt at bread turned to stone. Richard never complained. He just ate slower. Sometimes she thought he might even be hiding a smile, though it was gone before she could be sure. One afternoon, while the baby kicked restlessly in her arms, Jane realized how much he'd grown. He needed more than a blanket on the floor. She stared at the bundle beside the fire, wondering how she'd ever give this child something better. That evening after supper, Richard slipped out into the barn. She heard the faint scrape of wood against wood, the rhythmic tap of a hammer. Hours later, he returned, carrying something in his arms, a cradle, handmade, rough, uneven but strong. He set it down beside her without a word. Jane reached out, tracing her fingers along the knots in the grain. Her throat tightened. "Did you build this for him?" He only tipped his hat and stepped back into the cold night. Her tears came quietly this time, not from sorrow, but from the strange ache of kindness she didn't know how to carry. By week's end, their rhythm had changed. When Jane read softly to the baby from the tattered Bible page, Richard listened from across the room, whittling wood or mending gear. When she brushed the horses, he hauled water. It was like two halves of the same heartbeat, separate, yet steady together. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Jane felt something like belonging, but peace, she would soon learn, was a fragile thing. Because one night, the baby's breathing changed. He whimpered, then burned with fever. Jane's heart slammed against her ribs. "Something's wrong," she cried, clutching him tight. Please, he's burning up." Richard was already moving. He grabbed his coat, took the child from her arms, and wrapped him in layers of wool and leather. Then wordlessly, he motioned for her to follow. The door blew open, wind screaming through the gap, and before she could protest, they were outside running into the storm. Snow whipped across their faces, stinging like sand. Richard held the baby close to his chest, shoulders hunched against the gale. His boots struck the ice with thunderous determination. Jane stumbled behind him, barely able to keep up. The wind howled, the world went white, and still he never slowed. By the time they reached the doctor's cabin, Jane's legs were numb. Richard kicked the door open without knocking. The doctor looked up. Startled, but one look at the baby's flushed face was enough. Minutes blurred into hours, the storm raging outside. Finally, the doctor straightened. "Just a fever," he said. "A bad one, but he'll pull through." Jane sagged in relief. Richard stood by the window, hat in hand, eyes shadowed by firelight. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw something new in his silence. Not just strength, not just endurance, but tenderness, not duty, not obligation, something closer to love. The fever broke by dawn. The baby slept heavy and sweet, a damp curl plastered to his brow. Jane dozed in a chair by the hearth, waking only when the fire hissed and settled. Richard stood a long time at the window, hat in his hands, as if guarding the quiet with his breath. Almost a week later, the world softened. Snow thinned to slush. Birds tested the edges of morning, and the hills wore a faint wash of green like hope trying out its voice. Jane had just laid the baby down, humming under her breath, when a knock cut through the stillness. Two sharp raps that sounded like judgment. She opened the door halfway. A well-dressed man stood there. Trim beard, polished boots, gloves too clean for Wyoming. His eyes swept over her like a ledger line. "You must be her," he said, voice flat. "The girl my brother ruined." Jane's breath hitched. "Who are you?" "Charles Linton," he replied, stepping in without waiting. Snow fell from his coat onto the rug like he owned the floor it touched. "My brother's gone, left the territory." "Good riddance." "But that child." His gaze flicked toward the cradle. "He's blood. He deserves better than this." "This is his home," Jane said, fingers tightening around the door edge. "A shack in the hills with a silent cowboy?" He gave a cutting smile. "Be serious, Miss Hart." The name hit like a slap. She hadn't heard it aloud in months. "I go by Jane," she said, steadying. "Well then, Jane, I'm taking the boy. There's a mission orphanage 2 towns south. Proper care. A proper name. The law will favor family. His glance slid over her, cool and dismissive. What are you? A girl who followed a lie across a state line and forgot how to get back. He tipped his hat and left as abruptly as he'd come, leaving the door yawning to the cold. When Richard returned at dusk, Jane said nothing. She washed the tin plates, tucked the baby in, moved about the room as if the floor might crack if she stepped wrong. That night, after the house settled, she packed quietly, the shawl, a pouch of biscuits, the blanket that had carried the Bible page, and Richard's scarf, warmth she wasn't sure she had the right to keep. She kissed her son's hair and slipped into the dark. The snow was thin but stubborn in the trees, crusted hard where the wind had pressed it. She walked until her legs burned and the cold stung the inside of her nose. 2 miles, maybe a little more. Then the night breathed and a horse snorted. A lantern bloomed in the black. Richard emerged from the pines, reins in one hand, light in the other, face unreadable in the swing of gold. He didn't speak at first. Neither did she. I wasn't running from you, she whispered. I was running from what I bring with me. He tied the reins to a branch, stepped close enough for the lantern to find his eyes. Don't run from what don't need running, he said, voice low as if the dark might spook if he spoke too loud. Her throat closed. Charles Linton, he said, he'll take him. We'll see that he doesn't. Her eyes filled. You can't fight family and law in town. Not for me. Not for him. He held out his hand, not to drag her back, not to command, only to offer. Waiting, always waiting. In that way of his that felt like a door left open. She stared at his palm, blunt-knuckled and scarred, then placed her hand in it. They turned toward home, the lantern's small circle of light moving with them. The past howled somewhere behind, but the baby slept warm against her and Richard's scarf held the heat at her throat. Step by step the terror let go. By the time they reached the cabin, the sky was paling. He banked the fire while she settled the child. Only when the room was quiet again did he speak. You should have told me, he said gently. I didn't want you blamed for what I am. He studied her a long moment, then shook his head once. I don't take blame I don't own, and I don't let go what I've already decided to hold. The words lodged somewhere deep and trembling. She nodded, unable to speak. They didn't sleep. Dawn found them both sitting by the hearth, watching the baby breathe. Spring kept its promise. Jane learned the barn sounds until they stopped being startles and became a kind of music. The clop of hooves, the creak of a stall door, the warm sigh of an animal settling. She saddled without being told, her smaller hands moving sure and quick. She rose before the baby woke, and every morning a steaming tin cup waited for her at the table. No note, no flourish, presence. She began to notice the ledgers, too, names and numbers tucked in a wooden chest. She opened one and traced the columns with a finger. When she misread a total, Richard tipped the page toward her, tapped once near the mistake, then waited until she found it. No scolding, no sermon. Respect felt like its own medicine. Around the house, problems simply ended. A sticking drawer slid smooth. A loose porch board no longer rocked. A bent spoon lay straight in the tin. He never mentioned any of it. In his world, action was the plainest speech. She tried speaking his language back. After mending the torn seam of his glove, she didn't set it on the table. She hung it on a peg by the mare's stall. The next morning, she watched him pause, thumb brushing the repaired edge. He didn't say a word. The moment said enough. Their life thickened around gestures, a bowl of stew left by the hearth, a shawl draped across her shoulders after a long day, the way he took the outside of the road when they walked, a new dialect fluent in glances and steady silence. But the world had its own vocabulary. On a Thursday ride into town for flour and nails, a voice cracked across the mercantile porch. Look what the cowboy dragged in. Rescue project or pleasure? Laughter snapped like kindling. Another voice, uglier. Cowboy saves a ain't that just like a man with too little shame? Heat flamed up Jane's neck. Her eyes dropped to the baby tucked against her chest. She prayed Richard hadn't heard. He had. His boots scraped wood as he turned. The street went quiet under the weight of his gaze. He didn't bark or bluster. He just let the silence point. She's the only one worth staying for, he said. The words fell like a hammer finding its nail. No one laughed. No one moved. He turned his back on the porch, walked to her, and held out his hand. She slid her fingers into his, and together they left the noise behind. She didn't need defending. But he did it anyway, and somehow that made her stronger. That night the house was very still. The baby slept early. Outside, a hinge squeaked and then didn't fixed. Jane sat at the small table in lamplight and moonlight, a scrap of paper before her. There were things she couldn't say aloud, not yet. So she wrote, "I never expected a man like you. I see the way you fix things without being asked. I think I love you." She didn't sign it. She folded it once and slid it under a faded shawl in the bottom drawer. A safe place for a trembling truth. 2 mornings later, the letter was gone. Richard had ridden out early. He'd said nothing at all. All day she waited for distance. It didn't come. That night, a small bundle lay on her pillow tied with twine. Inside, an oval brass pendant, worn and simple. 2 words carved by a patient hand. Jane Avery, the name she chose. And the name he chose, too. Tears came soft and grateful as she fastened it at her throat. She didn't feel borrowed anymore. She felt kept, not owned, but chosen. And for the first time since a train pulled away and left her on a wind-scoured platform, she slept without fear of being sent away. Spring drifted into summer, and the mountains traded snow for wildflowers. The cabin that had once smelled of smoke and damp wool now carried the scent of soap, pine, and bread that didn't burn anymore. Jane had found her rhythm. The mornings came with birdsong instead of wind, and every day unfolded in quiet harmony, unspoken, easy, almost sacred. The baby, her baby, had started to crawl, his laughter ringing through the house like a hymn. She spent her days between chores and lessons, her nights beside the fire, rocking him until his tiny hands went still. Sometimes when she looked down at him, she saw her own second chance reflected in his eyes. And always, there was Richard. He had become her constant, never intrusive, never demanding, just there. The sound of his boots outside before dawn, the scrape of his chair at supper, the way he wordlessly left small kindnesses in his wake. A mended pail handle, a fixed latch, a new shawl folded over the chair when she was too tired to fetch it herself. He didn't ask for thanks. Didn't need them. That was the strange beauty of Richard Avery. He built safety like a man built fences, quiet, deliberate, strong. One morning, she woke to find a small leather-bound book on the table. The first page, written in Richard's careful, blocky handwriting, said only, "For the boy, when he's old enough to read." Her heart clenched. She ran her fingers across the words as if they might vanish. She looked toward the barn where Richard was already at work, hammer echoing against the boards. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat closed, so instead she cooked breakfast. Biscuits and eggs, still uneven but golden at the edges. When he came in, brushing sawdust from his sleeves, she said softly, "There's food." He nodded, took a seat, and began to eat. Halfway through, he paused. "You're getting better at this," Jane blinked. It was the first compliment he'd ever given her out loud. "Thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He grunted, almost embarrassed by his own words, then went back to eating, but she caught the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That evening, the sky turned lavender over the ridge. Jane sat on the porch, the baby asleep in her lap, the world humming with crickets and wind. Richard joined her, lowering himself onto the step beside her, his shoulders heavy from work. She broke the silence first. "Do you ever miss talking?" He looked at her, brow furrowed slightly as if searching for the right words. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Used to think silence made things easier. Now I'm not so sure." Jane tilted her head, studying him in the fading light. "You talk more than you think, you know." He raised an eyebrow. "Not with words," she said, "but with everything else." He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual before turning back toward the horizon. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full. Summer deepened and Dust Creek began to thaw, not just in weather but in heart. When Jane went into town, the stares had softened. The whispers quieted. Mrs. Yates, the storekeeper's wife, even smiled once, handing her a jar of molasses with a gentle, "For the little one." Jane had learned not to shrink under the weight of other people's eyes. She carried herself differently now, straighter, steadier, like a woman who had survived the winter and earned her spring. One afternoon, while she bartered for sugar, she overheard a ranch hand muttering to his companion, "Avery's got himself a woman now. Didn't think he'd ever let someone close again." The other man replied, "After what happened to his wife? I reckon he deserves peace, Jane froze. Wife she'd never asked, and he'd never told. That night, when Richard returned from mending fences, she lingered by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "Richard," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" He looked up, wary but open. "Your wife. What happened to her?" He didn't speak for a long moment. The fire popped between them. "She got sick," he said finally. "Too far from a doctor, too late by the time I found one." Jane swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he nodded once. "I wasn't much good to anyone after that. Thought maybe I'd stay quiet until the world forgot me." Her eyes glistened. "And did it?" His voice softened. "It tried." Neither spoke after that. But when he set his cup down, his hand brushed hers, barely there, but enough. Enough to tell her that the world hadn't succeeded. As the weeks passed, Jane's letter, the one he'd never mentioned, burned in her mind. Sometimes she wondered if he'd understood what she meant, or if he'd only seen it as gratitude. But then she'd catch him watching her, eyes gentle, or find another quiet gift on the table. A pair of boots for her, mended and polished, and she knew. He had understood. By August, the valley shimmered with heat. The baby had taken his first steps in the yard, tumbling toward Richard's boots with a laugh that broke open the day. Richard caught him easily, lifting him into the air with a rare, full smile that made something in Jane's chest ache. "Look at him," she said, laughing. "He's fearless." "Good," Richard murmured. "World needs more of that." He set the child down gently, his hand lingering on the boy's back just long enough for Jane to see the truth. This wasn't just kindness anymore. This was family. That night, when the stars came out, Jane stood in the doorway and whispered into the dark, "Thank you, God." Not because she'd been saved, but because, after all the storms, she had found someone who stayed, and yet, peace has a way of testing those who find it. Because one crisp morning, as the leaves began to turn gold, a new knock echoed on their door, slow, deliberate, and full of purpose. Jane's hand stilled on the basin. Richard turned, his expression unreadable. When he opened the door, two men stood outside. One carried a leather satchel. The other, a folded piece of paper stamped with a seal. "Richard Avery," the taller one asked. "By order of the county, we've come on behalf of the Linton family." Jane's heart stopped. The taller man stepped forward, the paper in his hand trembling slightly from the mountain wind. Jane felt it before she understood it, a cold, creeping dread that rooted her where she stood. Richard didn't take the paper at first. He stood framed in the doorway, boots braced, jaw set like carved stone. The baby stirred in Jane's arms, sensing her heartbeat thundering against him. The man cleared his throat. "Miss Hart, it's Avery," Richard interrupted, his voice low but steady. "Her name is Jane Avery." The shorter man glanced up, eyes flicking between them. "Be that as it may, sir. We've been instructed to retrieve the child of one Charles Linton's late brother. Custody petition's been signed by the family and recognized by the county magistrate." He unfolded the paper, its seal glinting red in the morning light. "They have claim to the boy." Jane's breath came sharp, shallow. Her fingers tightened around her son. "They can't." "They can," the tall man said, though not unkindly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We're just following order." Richard didn't move. "You'll follow them somewhere else." The two men shifted uneasily. No one ever liked standing in the path of Richard Avery. "Mr. Avery," the shorter one began, "don't make this harder than it needs to be. You know the law." Richard's voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder. "I know right from wrong. And this?" He nodded toward the child in Jane's arms. "Ain't wrong," the taller man sighed, wiping his brow. "We've got 2 more stops today, sir. Let's not turn this into trouble." Richard stepped forward close enough that the man's breath hitched. "There's already trouble," he said. "You just haven't met it yet." The men exchanged glances, then backed down the steps. "We'll return with the sheriff," the shorter one warned. "Bring him," Richard said simply. The moment they disappeared down the road, Jane crumpled against the doorframe, the baby wailing against her shoulder. Richard caught her before she fell. "Hey," he said, voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "We'll figure this out." She shook her head violently. "They'll come back, Richard. You can't fight the law. You can't fight blood." He cupped her face, rough hands trembling slightly. "Maybe not. But I can stand." And somehow in his eyes she believed him. The next days crawled like winter, slow, brittle, sleepless. Richard spent his hours outside, chopping wood that didn't need chopping, hammering a fence that already stood straight. Jane watched from the window, the ache in her chest heavy as stone. When he came in, his shirt clung to him with sweat, his hair darkened by work and worry. She wanted to tell him to stop, to rest, to plan, but words failed her. He didn't rest. He didn't plan. He simply stayed near. Every night she heard him step outside, the boards creaking under his boots, the sound of his quiet breathing mixing with the wind. Standing guard. By the fourth day she couldn't bear the silence. "Richard," she said as he came in with an armload of wood. "If the sheriff comes, they'll take him. We both know it." He set the logs down carefully, not looking at her. "Let them try. You'll be arrested." He looked up then, eyes fierce but tired. Better me than him. The truth of it cracked something inside her. She turned away, pressing her forehead against the window pane. "You can't save us from everything." "I don't aim to," he said. "Just from the things I can stand in front of." She closed her eyes. "You'll get yourself killed," he hesitated. "Then I'll die doing something that mattered." The air between them hummed with everything they couldn't say. Finally, she whispered, "Why are you doing this? Why risk so much for us?" He met her gaze, voice low. "Because someone once stood by me when I didn't deserve it. Caroline, my wife, she did that. I couldn't save her. But I can damn well try again." Tears blurred her vision. "You don't owe me your redemption." "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But maybe I owe her my trying." The sheriff came at dawn 3 days later. Dust rose from the road long before the wagon appeared. Jane saw the glint of badges through the morning haze and froze. Richard stepped onto the porch. Rifle slung over one shoulder, not raised, just visible. The sheriff, a heavy-set man with years of peacekeeping carved into his frown, called out, "Mornin', Avery, don't make me do this the hard way." Richard didn't move. "You don't have to do it at all. Court's clear," the sheriff said. "Custody falls to the Lintons. You're harboring a child under false claim." Jane stepped outside, her baby clutching at her shawl. "False claim?" she said, voice shaking. "I bore him." The sheriff's tone softened. "Ma'am, it's not that simple. The family's petition says you're unfit. No husband. No support. And the preacher back east, your father, signed testimony." Jane's knees nearly gave out. "My father?" Richard caught her by the elbow, steadying her. "Inside," he murmured. "No." Her voice broke. "I won't hide from this." The sheriff dismounted, hat in hand. "Ma'am, please, don't make this worse." Richard's rifle shifted, subtle but enough. "She's not going anywhere." The sheriff sighed. "I can't walk away empty-handed." "Then you'll walk away wrong," Richard said. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The shorter deputy, nervous, young, reached for his gun. Richard's rifle came up like lightning. "Don't," he warned. The boy froze, but the sheriff barked, "Easy now." Tension hung thick in the air, one wrong breath from breaking. Then Jane stepped between them. "No more," she said, voice rising above the wind. "No more guns, no more taking. This baby is mine. You want to drag me to jail, do it. But you'll do it seeing me stand." The sheriff's mouth opened, then closed. Something changed in his eyes. Respect maybe, or shame. He looked at the child, then at her, then at Richard. Unflinching, quiet, ready to fight the whole world. Finally, the sheriff said, "Paper's only worth as much as the man who signs it. And I've seen enough." He turned to his men. "Mount up." "But sir," I said, "mount up." The deputies obeyed. When they were gone, Jane's legs gave way. Richard caught her as she sagged into him, her tears dampening his shirt. "You didn't have to," she began. "I did," he said. "Now it's done." She shook her head, breathless. "It's never done." "Not really." He looked down at her, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Maybe not. But for now, it's ours." That night, the wind changed. Soft, warm, carrying the smell of rain. Jane sat by the fire, rocking the baby as Richard patched a torn saddle strap. The storm outside was gentle, the thunder distant, the kind that lulled more than frightened. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Truly safe. She looked across the flickering firelight at the man who had risked everything for her. "You're not silent, you know," she said quietly. "Not anymore." He looked up, curious. "You speak plenty," she said. "You just use the kind of words most people forget how to say." He smiled then, slow and rare. Guess you learned how to hear him. Guess I did. And for the first time since stepping off that train into the frozen dark, Jane didn't feel nameless. She felt home. Morning light came slow and golden through the cabin's windows, falling across the rough-hewn floorboards like a benediction. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. Jane woke to the sound of Richard outside, the steady rhythm of his axe splitting wood, each strike deliberate and sure. The baby cooed beside her in the cradle, now far too small for him. He'd grown quickly, sturdy, curious, full of laughter that seemed to chase the ghosts from every corner of the room. Jane smiled sleepily, brushing a hand through his soft hair. For a long time she had feared that peace was something fragile, a dream easily stolen. But weeks had passed since the sheriff's visit and no one had come back. The papers, the names, the shame, they all felt distant now, like a story that belonged to someone else. She went outside to hang the wash. The hills rolled green again, dotted with wildflowers, the creek below sparkling under the new sun. Richard was chopping wood near the fence line, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his movements fluid and practiced. When he saw her watching, he gave a small nod before going back to work. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't pretense. It was acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that spoke louder than words. That afternoon, Jane packed a basket and walked to the edge of the field where Richard was repairing the gate. "You missed lunch," she said. He wiped his hands on his trousers. "Didn't notice." "You'd notice when you pass out," she said, setting down the basket with mock sternness. "Now sit." A corner of his mouth twitched, his version of a laugh. He obeyed, settling on the grass beside her. She unpacked bread, cheese, and dried apples, laying them neatly on a cloth. The baby crawled nearby, fascinated by dandelions. For a while they ate in companionable silence. The wind carried the hum of bees and the scent of wild thyme. Then Jane spoke softly, as if afraid the moment might break. "You ever think about leaving?" He looked up, the question catching him off guard. "Leaving?" "Dust Creek, the hills, all of it. There's a whole world out there." He chewed slowly, then shrugged. "Had enough of the world to know this is the part worth keeping." She smiled faintly. "You make it sound simple." "It is," he said. "You stay where you're needed." Jane looked down at her hands, tracing the weave of the basket. "And where do you think you're needed, Richard Avery?" He didn't answer right away. The wind rustled through the grass. Finally, he said, "Here'll do." Her heart stumbled a little at the quiet certainty in his voice. That evening, after the baby was asleep, she found him by the porch railing, whittling a piece of pine into something she couldn't quite see. She sat beside him, tucking her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What are you making?" she asked. He turned the carving in his hands. "A small horse, delicate and smooth. Figured he might want company for that cradle." Jane laughed softly. "You'll carve him a whole barnyard at this rate." "Maybe," Richard said, glancing at her with that small smile again. "Figure every child deserves something built just for them." They sat in easy silence for a long time, the night filled with the chirping of crickets. Jane tilted her head back to look at the stars, so many, so bright it almost hurt to look. "You ever think," she murmured, "how far we've come from that train station?" Richard paused his carving. "Think about it most nights. I thought I'd die there," she admitted. "I thought that was the end of me." He was quiet, the knife in his hand still. "Funny thing about endings," he said. "They make room for what's next." Jane looked at him then, really looked. The man who had carried her through the storm stood against the law, built her a life log by log. "And what's next for you?" she asked softly. He hesitated, eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. "Depends what you'll let me hope for." Her breath caught. The world felt suddenly very small and very full. The next morning, the world began to test that fragile peace. Richard had gone into town for supplies. He should have been back by midday, but the sun had long since crossed the ridge and still he hadn't returned. Jane paced the yard, the baby on her hip, her heart tightening with every passing hour. By dusk, worry had turned to fear. The trail from town was empty, save for dust and the slow roll of fog creeping through the valley. When hoofbeats finally echoed through the trees, she ran to the porch. Relief flooded her, then froze. It wasn't Richard. A rider she didn't recognize pulled up, his horse panting, sweat darkening its flanks. He tipped his hat grimly. "Ma'am, you're Mrs. Avery?" Jane swallowed hard. "Yes, there's been trouble," he said. "Down by the creek near town." Her stomach turned to ice. "What kind of trouble?" "Some fellas from the Linton family. They were waiting." Avery didn't draw, but they didn't care to talk. "He's hurt bad." The baby whimpered, sensing her panic. "Where?" she demanded. "They took him to Doc Mallory's. You'd best come quick." By the time she reached the doctor's house, the sky had gone dark. The lantern outside swung in the wind, throwing jittery shadows against the walls. Jane burst through the door. "Richard!" The doctor turned sharply. "Quiet," he said. "He's resting." Her eyes darted past him, and there he was, lying on the cot, shirt torn, bandaged around the shoulder and ribs. His face was pale, but his chest rose steady beneath the blanket. Jane staggered forward. "What did they—" "Bullet grazed him," the doctor said. "Lucky. Another inch and it'd have been his lung. He'll live." Her knees nearly buckled. She sank to the chair beside him, taking his hand. It was warm, thank God, still warm. Richard's eyes fluttered open. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. "Don't you dare say that," she said fiercely, pressing his hand to her cheek. "You're all I've got." He managed a faint smile. "Then you've got poor taste." A shaky laugh escaped her. "And you've got terrible aim." They stayed like that, hand in hand, as the doctor worked quietly in the corner. When Richard finally drifted to sleep, Jane brushed the hair from his forehead and whispered, "You don't get to leave me." Richard Avery. Not now. He was home within a week, stubborn as ever, refusing more than a few days' rest. But something in him had changed. He moved slower, spoke softer, as though every breath reminded him how close he'd come to losing everything. Jane noticed it too, the way he looked at her longer, lingered when she brushed past him, touched the child's head with reverence instead of routine. Life returned to its rhythm, but it wasn't the same rhythm as before. It was deeper, anchored. That night, under a sky washed in moonlight, Richard stepped onto the porch and said quietly, "I've been thinking." Jane turned, a smile ghosting her lips. "That sounds dangerous." He chuckled, a low, rare sound that warmed her to her bones. "Maybe, but I've decided something." "What's that?" He looked at her, the lamplight catching the silver at his temples. "I'm done running from ghosts. You and him, you're my home now, Jane, if you'll have me." Her eyes filled. "I already do." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of pine and smoke that always clung to his shirt. His hand brushed her cheek, rough thumb tracing her jaw like a vow. Then he kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss made for stories or songs. It was quiet, steady, sure. The kind that sealed something built slow and honest. And when he drew back, forehead resting against hers, Jane whispered, "Welcome home." He smiled faintly. "Been here a while, I think." Autumn rolled down the mountain like a soft sigh. Amber leaves, cooler air, the scent of wood smoke drifting from every cabin in Dust Creek. Life had settled into something steady and whole. The kind of peace people talked about but rarely touched. Richard healed slow but sure. His shoulder was still stiff on cold mornings, but he never complained. He worked one-handed until strength returned, splitting logs, mending fences, teaching the boy, who now toddled everywhere, to balance pebbles on the porch rail just to knock them off again. Jane watched them from the doorway one morning, arms folded, heart full. The sunlight caught in Richard's hair, silvering the edges, and for a moment the whole world seemed to pause. "You'll spoil him," she teased. Richard looked over his shoulder, a small smile tugging his mouth. "Reckon he's already spoiled." The boy giggled, clutching a smooth stone in each tiny fist. "Da!" he shouted proudly. Jane froze. Richard did too. It was the first time the child had said it. No stutter, no mistake. Just as Jane's throat tightened. "He's talking." Richard blinked, stunned. "Guess he is." The boy threw his arms up toward him. Richard lifted him easily, holding him close as the little one babbled nonsense between laughter. The name lingered in the air, warm as sunlight on their faces. And in that single word, something unspoken between them finally found its shape. That evening, Jane cooked stew over the fire while Richard sanded a new beam for the barn. The baby sat on a blanket nearby, gnawing at a wooden horse. Outside, the air carried the crisp edge of the coming winter. When supper was ready, She ladled stew into bowls and called softly, "You'll miss it if you keep fussing with that beam." Richard wiped his hands on a rag and came inside. "Can't have the roof giving way. Snow's early this year." "It's October," she said, smiling. "In the mountains, that counts as winter." He set his tools aside and sat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The firelight flickered between them, painting his face in shades of gold and shadow. Jane finally broke the quiet. "Do you ever think about what it means, home?" Richard's gaze softened. "Every day." She stirred her stew, then said quietly, "When I was little, my father used to say home was the place where God put you to be good. I thought I'd lost that forever." He leaned forward slightly. "Maybe you just had to find where God meant you to be." Her eyes met his. "And where's that, you think?" He looked around, the fire, the cradle, the rough-hewn walls. "Right here seems pretty close." Jane smiled through sudden tears. "You always make things sound simple. Doesn't mean it's easy," he murmured. The next week, word spread through town. Reverend Hale had passed away in his sleep. The church, long neglected and half-empty, would soon close its doors. When Jane heard, she set down her mending and said softly, "That church was where I learned my letters." "Before everything changed." Richard nodded. "Maybe it's time it opened again for something new." She looked up sharply. "You think I should?" He shrugged. "Kids in town need learning. You've got the patience for it." "And the heart." Jane bit her lip. "They wouldn't trust me." "They already do," he said. "They just don't know it yet." A month later, the old church bell rang again, not for sermons but for lessons. Jane stood at the front of the room with chalk dust on her fingers and a dozen children staring back, wide-eyed and eager. Some were ranchers' sons, others orphans from the nearby valley. She started with the alphabet, her voice clear and steady. By the time she reached the letter J, her smile wouldn't stop. Outside, through the open window, she caught sight of Richard repairing the fence with two of the older boys, guiding their hands with patient care. The sound of their laughter drifted inside like music. It was the sound of something lasting. That winter was kind. Snow came, but never hard enough to break them. The cabin stood firm beneath its roof of pine shingles, each one nailed by Richard's hand, each wall chinked tight by Jane's. Christmas morning arrived bright and cold. The boy, chubby and curious, stumbled from his blanket toward the tree Richard had cut from the ridge. Its branches hung with simple ornaments carved from wood. Jane unwrapped a parcel left on her chair, a small tin necklace box. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a silver ring, simple, smooth, made by hand. She looked up, startled. "Richard." He stood by the hearth, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. "Ain't much," he said quietly. "Didn't have the shine for store-bought." Her voice trembled. "You made this?" "Figured it was about time I did something right by you." She rose slowly, crossing the room until she stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Richard Avery," she said softly, "you've done right by me since the day you didn't walk past." He exhaled, eyes meeting hers. "Still feels like I should ask proper." "You just did." The corners of his mouth twitched. "And?" She smiled through tears. "And yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It wasn't gold, but it gleamed all the same. The baby clapped his hands, laughing as if he somehow understood. Later, when night fell and the stars turned the snow silver, Jane sat on the porch with the boy sleeping in her lap. Richard joined her quietly, his arm draping around her shoulders. "I never thought I'd have this again," she whispered. He looked out over the valley, voice low. "Neither did I." For a long while, they sat listening to the wind, the steady breath of a child, and the soft creak of wood beneath their feet. The world beyond Dust Creek might still hold storms, but here, between the warmth of the hearth and the quiet strength of the man, beside her, Jane had found what she once thought lost, forever. Not salvation, not forgiveness, but grace. The kind you build yourself log by log with a man who knows how to stay. Spring returned to Dust Creek with the gentlest touch, buds unfurling on the aspen branches, the river running wild with snowmelt, and sunlight lingering longer each day. The world felt alive again, humming quietly beneath the blue sky, as if the land itself had been waiting for something worth blooming for. Jane stood on the porch, her hand resting on her belly, round beneath her apron. 4 months along, and already the whole town knew. For once, the whispers weren't cruel. They were curious, even warm. The same women who once turned their backs now stopped by with quilts and baby clothes and baskets of bread. It felt strange. Acceptance. It was a softer kind of miracle than she'd prayed for, but a miracle all the same. Richard was in the yard, mending the corral fence with Ben Mallister, a young ranch hand who came by to help most mornings. The boy was barely 15 but looked at Richard like a man looks at a legend. "Don't twist the wire that way," Richard said calmly, demonstrating. "You'll cut your palm clean open." "Yes, sir." Ben corrected himself, smiling sheepishly. Jane leaned on the porch post, watching them both with quiet pride. The baby toddled nearby, his laughter floating across the air like music. It had been a year since that first storm, the one that nearly tore everything apart, and somehow they'd built something solid from the ruin. Something that held. By afternoon, the valley filled with voices. Neighbors from all around came for the barn raising, a tradition Dust Creek hadn't seen in years. The men carried timber, the women brought food, and laughter echoed from the hills. Jane moved among them easily now, ladling stew into bowls, her hair tied back in a bright ribbon Richard had given her last Christmas. Mrs. Yates, once her harshest critic, stood beside her at the table, smiling faintly. "You taught us something, you know," Mrs. Yates said, wiping her hands on her apron. Jane glanced up, startled. "What's that?" "That family isn't about who gossips over your name," the older woman said, her voice gentler than Jane had ever heard it. "It's about who stays to build when everyone else walks away." Jane's throat tightened. "Thank you," Mrs. Yates nodded, eyes glistening. "You made a home out of a storm, dear. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The barn went up quick under the spring sun, post by post, beam by beam. Richard worked side by side with the townsfolk, his movements strong but unhurried. Sweat darkened his shirt, dust clung to his arms, but his smile came easier now, less guarded, as if some long burden had finally been set down. When the final rafter slid into place, Reverend Mallory, Hale's successor, stepped forward, Bible in hand. His voice carried warm and steady across the crowd. "Built on good ground," he said, "by good people. May this barn stand as long as the hearts that raised it." "Amen," murmured the crowd. Richard caught Jane's eye across the field. She raised a hand and he answered with the smallest nod, the corner of his mouth lifting. No words needed. As twilight deepened, torches were lit and music broke out. A fiddle, a harmonica, boots tapping rhythm on the packed earth. The children chased fireflies while the adults laughed and danced. Jane sat on a hay bale, the boy in her lap, watching it all. Her heart swelled with a kind of joy she'd never dared to imagine back on that frozen platform where her story began. Richard came to her after a while, brushing sawdust from his hair. "You're supposed to be sitting still," he teased gently. "I am," she said. "Mostly." He crouched before her, hand brushing her knee. "How's the little one?" "Both of them," she said softly, laying her palm over her stomach, "are just fine." He smiled, that rare, quiet smile that still made her breath catch. "Good." A moment of silence passed, tender as dusk. Then she said, "Do you ever think about what we'd tell him someday about how it all started?" He looked thoughtful, gaze drifting toward the dark horizon. "Maybe I'd tell him his mama was the bravest soul I ever met, and that his old man was lucky enough to show up at the right train station." Jane laughed softly. "That's not how I remember it." "How do you remember it then?" "I remember a man who didn't ask questions. Who saw a girl with no name and said, 'You do now?'" Richard's voice dropped low. "Still mean it." Later, when the music quieted and the torches burned low, Jane walked toward the new barn. The stars shimmered above, clear, sharp, endless. Inside, the scent of fresh pine filled the air. Richard followed, carrying the sleeping boy in his arms. He set the child down gently on a blanket of hay, and for a while they just stood there listening to his small, steady breathing. "You ever wonder," Jane said quietly, "if all this was meant to be, or if we just chose it?" Richard's arm slipped around her shoulders. "Don't reckon it matters," he said. "Either way, we're here, and we stayed." She leaned into him, closing her eyes. "That's what matters most, isn't it?" "Always," he said simply. The months passed and summer came soft and green. The new barn stood strong, the fields golden with promise. Jane's belly grew, her hands busy with sewing, her heart steady with gratitude. On a warm June morning, she gave birth to a daughter. Richard was there, holding her hand, whispering quiet encouragement until the baby's first cry filled the room. When the midwife placed the newborn in Jane's arms, she looked up through tears. "What should we call her?" Richard smiled faintly. "You choose." Jane looked down at the tiny face, so new, so perfect. "Grace," she whispered. "Because that's what this is," he nodded. "Grace Avery," he said, tasting the name like a prayer. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, flooding the room with light. Years later, folks in Dust Creek would still tell the story of the nameless woman who stepped off a train one winter night, holding a baby and nothing else. They'd speak of the silent cowboy who gave her a name, a home, and a life built from kindness instead of judgment. Some called it luck, others called it redemption, but those who knew better said it was simpler than that. Two broken souls who refused to walk away. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in rose and gold, Jane sat on the porch swing with Grace asleep against her chest and her son playing in the yard. Richard poured her tea, the same way he had every evening since the day they met. He handed her the cup without a word, and she smiled. "You still don't talk much," she teased softly. He looked out over the land, their land, and said, "Don't need to. Got everything worth saying right here." She leaned her head against his shoulder, content, the rhythm of his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. Beyond the porch, the barn glowed warm in the fading light, and the world was exactly as it should be. Home, the place where love had stayed. If this story moved your heart, remember, sometimes the West wasn't won by guns or gold, but by people who dared to stay when it was easier to walk away. Like, share, and subscribe to Western Love Story for more tales of second chances. Quiet courage and love that endures beyond the storm. Because out here, even the lost can be found if someone simply says, "You do now."